Thank you for your patience, and good evening. It's a great pleasure to introduce Alexandra Styron, whose recent memoir, Reading My Father, published by Scribner in 2011, has been widely acclaimed. A few years back, she wrote All the Finest Girls, a novel, and today teaches memoir writing at Hunter College, contributes articles to leading publications in the US and abroad, and is embarking on a new literary project. I'm very glad that we're able to host Al at this venerable library, which some of you may not know acted as the de facto Library of Congress in New York at Federal Hall when George Washington was president and John Adams vice president. Alexandra's participation here came to me as an obvious idea after I had finished her memoir and felt the rest of the world should know about it too. I sent Al, a longtime acquaintance, a fan email, which read in part, "Your memoir is superb, elegantly written, full of wit and tenderness, and nuanced so cleverly. Despite a busy household, I retreated to the bedroom and read your work cover to cover, simply unable to put it down." After a few more comments about recognizing in Reading My Father many people and places, as I too spent my summers, my early ones especially, on Martha's Vineyard, I added, "On a deeper level, your thoughts on depression touched me greatly. I read your father's work a long time ago, and his ordeal and his book are starkly vivid. Congratulations on a remarkable achievement, so personal a work, yet offering such broad appeal." Alexandra will talk tonight about the memoir genre and her experiences depicted in the book, and discuss her complex relationship with her father, who so influenced her own writing trajectory. Her lecture, and your questions afterwards, will be up, you should all know, on the Society Library's channel on YouTube, something that George Washington and John Adams and the founders of the New York Society Library would have found a very bizarre phenomenon. Copies of our book will be on sale right out here in the exhibit area, courtesy of our friends at the corner bookstore afterwards. Please join me in welcoming an extraordinary talent, Al Styron.
Hi, thank you all for coming. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Alan, and thank you everybody at the library. And to all of you for enduring Park Slope mother's wending her way here down to FDR. I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about how I came to write this book. In the months since Reading My Father was published, I found that people are curious to know how a writer arrives at the decision to tell the truth. Truth, of course, being a totally subjective reality. Like many of you, I'm bemused and sometimes horrified by the current vogue for exhibitionism as entertainment. It feels a little bit like some sort of perverse adolescent locker room game. One girl takes her clothes off and then the rest of the class gleefully points out her imperfections. The abdication of dignity on display in television and magazines and tell-all books, combined with the spirit of meanness celebrated in the audience's response, creates a peculiar and confusing arena in which to enter with the memoir. In my case, there were a lot of issues that preceded my decision to sit down 4 years ago to write about my father. Not least of all my challenges was a certain ambivalence toward immersing myself in the chief subject. My father's death, after an agonizing battle with clinical depression, was a long time coming. His last 6 years had been fraught and frightening. Our family, my mother Rose most significantly, but also my 3 siblings and I, had been consumed off and on by Daddy's health crisis. We gave a lot of our time to seeing him through the roller coaster of recovery and setbacks, hospitalizations and rehabs, small victories and precipitous declines that characterized those years. Daddy was both a wonderful man and an impossible one. If it was ever a secret, it certainly isn't anymore that he often came up short in the fathering department. I sometimes felt during my father's worst years like I gave not only all I had to him, but much more than he deserved. So when he died in November of 2006, I grieved the loss, but I confess I also felt some relief. In Brooklyn, I had my own new family waiting for me, and a second novel I'd been trying to write in between getting married and giving birth to 2 children. The time had come to shake loose from the tremendous weight my father's existence had exerted on me in so many ways. I was fatherless, orphaned in some respects, but also free. Thinking about my father held little appeal for me. I guess my first sign that I had unfinished business to attend to came during the winter of 2007. My children were no longer babies. My father was resting in his grave. But several years in, I was still struggling to get beyond the first 100 pages of my novel. The sense of failure I felt and the gnawing idea that I would have to abandon the project filled me with dread. I was ashamed of my lack of productivity, but I kept it to myself for fear of seeming lazy or uncommitted. Writing is a lonely pursuit. When you layer a daily dose of self-doubt on that loneliness, you can find yourself slipping through the hatchway into a very dark place. I began thinking about my father a lot and how troublesome the creative process was for him. He spent years and years in the latter decades of his life working through various iterations on a novel about being a Marine in World War II. He couldn't seem to make the breakthrough he wished for, and when mental illness finally pulled him under, the book remained unfinished. I did the math. Between his last novel, Sophie's Choice, published in 1979, and his death, 27 years had passed. My father, a man completely in the thrall of his art, a writer who considered himself first and foremost a novelist, had not completed a novel in more than a quarter century. It was a daily reality that could have been nothing less than torturous for him. But, and this is something I guess I learned by example, it was a private agony not to be talked about. In a 1967 Life magazine interview, Daddy was asked how he approached his work. "Writing is a cruel and racking pursuit," he said. "I hope none of my children follows my path. I'd almost rather they become garbage collectors." Well, here I was, not a garbage collector, but a novelist, stuck and frightened. But if one tool of the trade hadn't failed me, it was the fiction writer's ability to identify with characters, real or imagined, no matter how prickly or unsympathetic. A scrim had risen. I could see my father from a new angle, and my heart went out to him. In April of that year, about 6 months after Daddy died, I got a phone call from 2 magazine editors. They had a contract to publish an anthology they were calling Brooklyn Was Mine. The title taken from a Walt Whitman poem. It was to be a book of essays about the borough by writers who lived there. Desperate to get away from my novel, I fairly leapt at the opportunity to contribute. I would write something breezy about living people, doing happy things, offer some original take on my adopted hometown. That I am a walking cliche, upper middle class white writer living in Park Slope Brownstone with my husband and 2 children, putting in brief detail his activities nearly every day of 1940, from New Year's until September, when he left for boarding school. The entries draw a portrait of American boyhood during the Depression that could practically stand alone in a time capsule for the era. Daddy and his friends Carl, Bozo, Naki, Leon, Buddy, Scudder, and Pete alternately fooled around, loafed around, piddled around, and loafed around some more. My father had a job, got up and toted papers for old man Adams, went to Sunday school, did his homework, and squired a few girls around town. Dick O and I both had dates. I had Peggy Barber, he had Jean. School wasn't much of a priority at 14, and either through shiftlessness, got kicked out of history class, or absenteeism, homesick again with earache, he seems to have had plenty of idle time. He and the guys were always playing chess or cards, going up to the stores in Hilton Village to loiter, gathering around the radio for Amos and Andy, or heading for a swim off the pier, a favorite destination Daddy once described as my second summer home, my hangout, my club, my Riviera, my salvation. Like most families, the Styrons were in tough financial straits. But in the spring, Grandpa scraped together $10 to buy my father a little beat-up sailboat. It had been dry docked for ages in a nearby shed, and with the help of his older cousin Hugh, Daddy spent weeks making the boat seaworthy. He loved the shoddy old skiff, but after enduring a few hairy trials, swampings, lost tillers, squalls, he lost some of his enthusiasm and decided to keep his water activities closer to shore. If one thing remained a constant in my father's life in 1940, it was the picture show. These were fine years for filmmaking, considered by many the golden age of movies. In 1939 alone, Hollywood produced, among other classics, Gone with the Wind, The Wizard of Oz, Ninotchka, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and Stagecoach. After a decade of ironing out the glitches wrought by the advent of sound, film was suddenly a polished, modern medium, and filmmakers were working hard to satisfy a nation in need of amusement. My father enjoyed many of the year's big pictures, including Gone with the Wind, which he and Leon took the train to Richmond to see. But he also lazed happily through dozens and dozens of more minor entertainments. In 1 week, as he noted in his diary, he caught Muni in We Are Not Alone, Sonia Henning in Everything Happens at Night, Edward G. Robinson in Blackmail, and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. 48 years later, in the spring of '88, my father spoke about the Wanamaker Diary, which he'd recently been perusing in a commencement address at Claremont McKenna College. It was a time of great uncertainty for him. With his first depression only 2 years past, he was still struggling to find his confidence again. The current iteration of Way of the Warrior, now called Marriott the Marine, wasn't working. And though the laurels bestowed upon him, the Légion d'honneur in '87, the Dowell Medal in '88, were pleasing, they also ramped up the pressure to justify such lionization. His childhood and the forces that shaped it had been on his mind a lot. He'd just written a Tidewater Morning for Esquire, and the idea of a book about Grandpa was in its beginning stages. So my father was already in a vulnerable state when shortly before his trip to California he began to lose sensation in his right hand, the result of a neck injury he'd suffered while on a training run during the Korean War. Tremendously anxious about impending surgery, he found himself unable to sleep. A doctor prescribed Halcyon for relief. And just as it had in '85, though he wouldn't piece it together for several more years, the sleeping aid wreaked havoc on his mind. Unable to stem the sudden tide of depression, he tried to back out of his commitments at Claremont, where he'd also agreed to teach a class. But it was too late. Accompanied by my mother, he flew out west in a state of abject terror. There, in that sunny landscape, he wrote later, I was all but totally consumed by thoughts of suicide that were like a form of lust. I kept constant schemes in mind to have my wife lured away so I could secrete myself in a closet and end it all with a plastic bag. Somehow, my father made it to graduation day, probably betraying little of his mood. He stood at the lectern and struck a humorously self-deprecating tone. He spoke about how startled he was by the teenage portrait of himself that emerged from the diary. I searched, he said, for the tiniest fragment of introspection, of romantic agony, the Weltschmerz, the self-lacerating moonings expected of an incipient novelist. There are no meditations on nature, on God, on our moral existence. There are not even any girls. Instead, there are only movies, once, twice, even 3 times a day. A rough count would indicate that during this particular summer, I went to close to 50 movies. There is no indication that during the summer I ever read a single book. No books at all. There is also no indication that the boy disappearing all day and night into the dark of a theater and the world of celluloid fantasy had just, a few months before, buried his mother. No indication of why Pop didn't feel so good on more than one occasion. And no indication of how it came to be that on a February evening, Daddy was in a position to remark, after supper, Pop went out to the hospital for a few weeks' rest, and Jim, Spotty, Bud, and I played cards over at the Hayes'. I'm spending nights there now. I was 5 the first time I had a thought of Pauline. That's my grandmother. It was 1971, around the time of my grandfather's 3rd marriage. I was, I suppose, just old enough to understand the rudiments of progenitorship, but not sufficiently sophisticated to plumb the mysteries of loss. Considering the woman Grandpop was to marry, it suddenly occurred to me that my father's real mother was a blank to me. My mother's father was dead, I knew that. She had a picture of him, and there were many more at Nana's house in Baltimore. But my father's mother, I'd never heard anyone mention her, never seen a picture, or any evidence that she existed. He must have had a mommy, I thought, or he had a mommy. Over the years, I absorbed errant details, Pauline, dead, cancer, but having been disappeared by Daddy and Grandpa, she was nothing more than a name in my head. Not until my father gave her an afterlife in the fiction of his later years did she take on any real dimensions for me. And she was not animate. She did not breathe. Then I found her voice at Duke. Dear Elmer, well, the boy got home all safe and sound, the very happiest child I've ever seen, You'll never know how grateful I am to you for opening up a new world to Billy. You remember I told you how enthusiastic he was at the prospect of a trip to Philadelphia? When I asked him if it was as grand as he thought it would be, his eyes popped, and from his heart he said, "Oh, 10,000 times better than I ever dreamed it could be." Pauline's letters were a total revelation to me. From them, she bursts forth a warm, winning, even exuberant figure. She is thoroughly engaged in her environment, penning descriptive passages on the day's weather, the state of the garden, and the comings and goings in her household, while always stopping short of what her intended reader might find tedious or overly informational. She's solicitous of her friends' well-being, charmingly frank about her own health, and proudly maternal. In some ways, he's so childlike, she continues in her thank you letter to Elmer after Daddy's trip to Philadelphia. And then again, I'm struck by his, shall I say, intelligence, and then he is sweet. It's not at all what I expected. Until recently, I'd known only one photograph of my grandmother. It's a formal mother and child portrait in which my father appears to be about 2 years old. Fair and round, he's dressed in a neat white romper, hair freshly cut, and stands on something to put him at eye level with his mother. Pauline, holding him about the waist, gazes at his face with a look of attentive pride. But though she must be only in her late 30s, she appears decades older. Even in black and white, it's obvious that her carefully marcelled hair is steel gray, and she wears quintessential granny glasses on her prominent beak. Her prim blouse and jacket, though entirely appropriate for the time, add to a schoolmarmish effect. And I now realize that for years I've been confusing her with another picture I've seen somewhere else of my legitimately aged great-grandmother. Inasmuch as I ever thought about Pauline, she was colorless, a pinched and faded daguerreotype who must have been bypassed entirely by youth and radiance. But it wasn't just her elderly look. My father's depiction of her in the stories of a Tidewater morning, and even fleetingly in Sophie's Choice, limned the portrait of a cross, pedagogic, humorless soul swamped by disappointment and bereft of whimsy. I can see now, through the fire of his experience, Daddy would have forged this image of her. About the same time that photograph was taken, Pauline was diagnosed with breast cancer. She underwent the common treatment of the day, a radical mastectomy of both breasts, which sent the disease into a brief remission. But it soon returned, this time in her bones, and for the next decade continued to metastasize through the rest of her body. It invaded her arms and legs, and the lining of her scalp. Her hair fell out. She had difficulty keeping her balance. And after she broke her leg in a fall, she had to be fitted with a metal brace. A gruesome contraption of steel and leather straps was how my father remembered it. Her bones refused to knit again, and she was compelled to wear the uncomfortable restrictive apparatus the rest of her life. It not only caused her wicked distress, but made it impossible for her to fold her legs at the piano bench. At the time when she probably needed it most, Pauline was unable to seek refuge in the comfort of music. She was in terrible pain all the time. It would have been hard to think straight, and harder still to keep up with an active little boy. At the onset of her cancer, Daddy was too young to understand what was happening. As the years and the disease progressed, no one talked with him about his mother's health, placated his fears, or solicited his feelings. My grandparents simply pulled the veil more tightly around their already stifled existence. Bill and Pauline attended Sunday service at the Presbyterian Church and were faithful patrons of the local classical music concert series. But beyond that, they had very little social interaction. The Victrola warbled and conversation batted about, but for the most part, 56 Hopkins Street was a quiet place. Daddy was encouraged to read or go out and play, but not to be a bother to his mother. The house's glum tone acted as a powerful agent on my father's memory, coloring his perception of Pauline then and his vision of her later. I'm just going to read this last little bit. In the spring of 1939, when my father was 14, Pauline's cancer made a rapid advance. Daddy was sent to stay with cousins for several weeks down near Little Washington. Coming home, he found his mother in terrible shape, bedridden, skeletal, in exquisite agony. Dr. Russell Buxton, son of the man who had delivered Daddy, attended to her daily, prescribing the maximum dosage of morphine several times a day. But no palliative seemed to put a dent in her pain. By July, it was obvious the end was near. In their small house, Daddy lay in his room at night under the weak breath of a fan, choking on summer heat and his unmitigated fear. In a Tidewater morning, Paul Whitehurst recollects, "Suddenly, my mother screamed, a scream long and hopeless, containing a note of anguish like nothing I had ever heard before. It was a shriek that swept up and down my naked body like a flame. It was an alien sound, which is to say unexpectedly beyond my sense of logic and my experience, so that for the barest instant it had the effect of something histrionic out of the movies, a Frankenstein Dracula film in which a bad actress emoted implausible terror. But it was real, and I plunged my face into my pillow, wrapping it about my head like a humid caul. I tried to shut out the scream. Deaf, in darkness, I sought to think of anything but that scream. I have no idea what last words were exchanged between mother and son. Daddy never could recall much about that time. Toward the very end, he was sent to his friend Buddy Hayes' house. Buddy's mother, Sally, a former teacher, ran a tight ship, but she took good care of my father. When, on the evening of July 20th, 1939, Pauline finally passed away, Sally broke the news gently. Daddy was upstairs at the Hayes' in a room by himself, reading. Billy, your mother is no longer with us. Daddy remembered her saying. He also remembered that he didn't cry. That was a jolly little passage, I'm sorry. I realized as I was reading, but I do feel like it's, you know, really, I think I discovered a lot about my father during this process, not least of which was that this essential grief in his life and the lack of grieving that he did was really, I think, at the heart of his struggle with mental illness later. So, and had I not had the great good fortune of spending time at the Duke Library and the great resource that a library can be, I don't think I would have ever been able to synthesize that information. So, I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has.
Yes. I wanted to ask Al, before you wrote your book, how much you studied the memoir writing genre, Nabokov and other people who've done it so well?
I definitely didn't study it. I had read, you know, many of the sort of seminal, great, like Nabokov memoirs, but I wasn't a big memoir reader. I wasn't. I don't think I had quite realized how enormous the genre, as we all know now, of course, has become. But I read a great deal during the writing of it, looking for a sort of model. Well, I didn't really find one, but it was very helpful to read a lot of different memoirs. And now that I teach memoir, all I do is read memoirs, and I never want to read another memoir.
How did your siblings feel about memoir?
They have been wonderful. They really embraced it. And I was very anxious about their response. And they were the first, other than my husband, they were the first people to see it.
And your mother?
And my mother. My mother, I think, was a bit of shock for her at first. And I think it's been a journey towards being able to see the story from my point of view. But she has thoroughly embraced it and follows me around the readings and has been my biggest fan. But it's been a big process. It was a big year for my family. My siblings and I think, as I say in the book, I think we sort of felt like trench mates. So we really did end up kind of seeing things very much the same way. They didn't have any quibbles with my portrayal. So I feel very lucky. I know things can go badly that way.
I wanted to know what your father's reaction or feelings about the interpretation of Sophie's choice. I've never read anything about that.
Interpretation.
The movie.
Oh, the film. He loved the film. I actually just came back from, I went to do a Q&A after a screening. It's the 30th anniversary of the film this year, and the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival had a screening of it. Yeah, he loved it. I think he really liked Alan Pakula. I think, you know, it's hard, so much of the book had to be left out.
Yeah.
It's much too complicated but given what Alan chose to do and the way he brought it down to that central story, I think my father thought it was wonderful, and he was quite pleased. He always liked this sort of coming out of his hole and being part of something that was a little more fun, and so that was a great time for him.
Hi, I'm Susanna Talley from Truman Talley Books, and I only say that because when e-publishing came out, we had our iPads, and we were resolute that we would never download a book. And then yours came out, and I said to my husband, this is a winner, and this is, you know, from the trenches, we've got to download this book. So we really, that's the only book remaining on my Kindle.
I'm so glad. Thank you.
I was very impressed by it. And to follow up, I just have a few questions to ask you because, first of all, I'm impressed with the time span. I know that the Nat Turner Diaries came after Sophie's Choice, or
The
before?
Confessions of Nat Turner?
Confessions
Oh,
of Nat Turner.
well before.
Well before,
67 was the
So
Confessions
it
of
was
Nat Turner.
then, from Sophie's Choice, 24 years of dry period.
Well, he wrote quite a great deal, but he couldn't finish the novel. He wrote Darkness Visible, and he wrote Tidewater Morning. He had a collection of essays. He wrote lots of pieces for magazines, but he was a man who considered himself a novelist first and foremost, and he could not get his hands around a story that he felt reached the same level as these books that he'd sort of set this impossible bar for himself.
So my question is, given that period, do you have any comments about how, I think of Faulkner and Hemingway and your dad, do you think there's any component between some madness and alcoholism with writing a fine novel? And if he did not suffer from those, what do you think he would have produced?
I certainly think there is a very strong link between mental illness and alcoholism. I think that many people drink to mask their depression. And in fact, my father had stopped drinking when he went through his first depression, and it was the stop in drinking that left him sort of unmanned. So there's a very strong link between those things. I think many scientists will corroborate that. I think the great artist who is crazy and an alcoholic is practically a cliche, and I think that they are. There is something about being vulnerable and being and plumbing those depths, both the horrors of the world, spending your day, thinking about slavery and Nazis is, would pull you down. But I think that being open and which you have to be a really first-rate artist, I think makes can really push you to the edge. That said, I would also say that I think mental illness, strikes people in every walk of life, and so does alcoholism. So I don't think it's exclusive or particularly glamorous, the connection between the two, because accountants and lawyers and plumbers get depressed and drink as well. So.
Do you think that Sophie functioned for him as an imprimatur of himself?
That's a nice question. One of the things my father discovered to his horror in his really most dire time towards the end of his life, when he was in and out of psychosis, was he realized that every book he'd ever written was about suicide. And so I think that I think all of his primary characters, and I think, again, I think that's always true to some extent. You are, like Flaubert said in Madame Bovary Saint Moi, most writers become their characters become them, but I absolutely think that despair channeled through a bigger, or painted on a bigger canvas, is certainly, there's some validity to that.
Can you tell us about your own discovery that you were going to be a writer and how old you were and how that came about?
Well, I came at it very circuitously. I thought I wanted to be an actress, and I was a theater major in college, and I struggled to become a successful actress and failed, and moved out to Los Angeles. I had a little theater company here, but I wasn't making any money, and I went out to LA. And when I got 3,000 miles away from here, I think mostly because I realized that I was a storyteller more than I was necessarily an actress. I started writing out there, but very much in secret. I didn't tell anyone I was writing. I took some workshops and didn't tell anyone. And when I finally, after working on it for a couple of years, and I had a very good teacher who said, you can do this, you should go home and go back to school, I did, and I came out of the closet, and announced my intentions to be a writer, and went back to school, went to Columbia, and got my MFA. But it was in my late 20s.
One more question. I couldn't believe the scary stories your father told you, and I'm just looking at you thinking you were such a survivor, because did he ever scoop you up in his arms afterwards and say, I'm only kidding? Or did you live in abject fear that these things were coming true?
He did not scoop me up in his arms and say, I'm only kidding. But there was an element to my father. If you read the book, you see that my father used to really scare the bejesus out of me and my siblings too when they were younger. He really pushed the limit of a child's, scaring a kid. It went beyond that. But there was always a little look in his eye, like, you get that this is a joke and you're not going to cry, are you? Because if you cry, then it won't be so much fun for me to, it was, I got it very early on that this was the way to befriend him. So weird as it may be.
Yeah.
How long before he died did he write Darkness Visible? And how deeply was he into his illness?
I think it was, the depression about which he wrote in Darkness Visible was 1985. And he was well enough again by, I think, maybe 87 or 88 to have written, he was asked to speak at Johns Hopkins at the Mood Disorders Symposium, and he spoke about it, and Tina Brown, who was then the editor of Vanity Fair, was in the audience, and she asked him to write a piece for Vanity Fair, and that piece became, and in an expanded version, became Darkness Visible. So it was a couple of years after his recovery that he began to sort of talk about depression. The first thing he wrote was a response to a New York Times piece about the death of Primo Levi. He took issue. He wrote an op-ed piece taking issue with some comments in the Times which suggested that Primo Levi, how could he commit suicide after all he'd been through? Can he survive? Why commit suicide? But so my father took to the paper to say, because you suffer, and that was when he sort of first publicly confessed his having been so ill. Yes.
Can you tell us more about his military experience? If I'm piecing it together, he served in Korea and then he served in Vietnam?
No, he served in World War II and he served in Korea. He was just old enough he was a freshman in college when he enlisted in World War II.
He volunteered?
Yeah. Couldn't wait, to be called up, and then was terrified. And then he was, but it was so I guess it was the end of World War II, when he was just old enough. Then the war ended, and but he had maintained his
Reserve obligation.
yeah, exactly. And then his first novel was about to come out. He was living in New York. He was about to be the toast of the town, and he got the letter in the mail. The Korean War began. He got the letter in the mail saying, remanding him to Camp Lejeune.
Was he proud of his experiences?
He was proud of his experiences and his, there's a big part of this book, and I think this is why he struggled for so long to write a World War II novel, which then became a Korean War novel. He wanted to write about the experience of being a Marine, about being, his deep ambivalence, of being a proud Marine, and the brotherhood and sort of fraternity that he was part of, and his essentially pacifist nature, and his horror at what had happened, his horror at the death and destruction. So that story was the story he was trying to tell, but he never saw combat, and I think that maybe that kept him at some distance from feeling like he could own the story. But that was his sort of mission in the last couple decades of his life. He was fixated on that story and on his relationship with military experience.
Did James West's book pose any kind of a challenge? Was it what was your relationship to that book?
Oh, I was very grateful for Jim's book. James West wrote a sort of a large biography of my father, which was an authorized biography and ended in 1994. He published in 1994, I think. So it missed this whole major last chapter of his life. But Jim is a dear friend of our family, and I don't know how I could have written this book without his help, and I've acknowledged him in many places. It was, he was just, he was the only living person who spent that kind of time researching the subject of my father before my father died. So he was this, he knew everything, and was hugely helpful.
How did your mother deal with the depression of the father?
Long suffering. She really, my mother's a remarkable woman, and she's the, her personality is the polar opposite of my father. She is the eternal optimist. She has, I've never seen her lose her sense of joy, even in my father's darkest time. She's just a soldier. She compartmentalizes a lot of things in order to survive, but it served her very well. Well, that's
Author will be at the front to sign books, and feel free to pick up copies, or if you brought your own copies, that's fine too, and we'll have her sit at this desk. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for your patience.